Hi, everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of week 5. Please be sure that you've watched the lecture on film first. I know that that's backwards because I'm asking you to do chapter 7 before chapter 6, but we're trying to go chronologically, so film before TV. At the end of this lecture, I will go through your assignments for the week, so make sure you stick around and watch that. In this chapter, we look at television's early technological development. We discuss the TV boom of the 1950s. We examine cable's technological development and the basic services it provided, explore new viewing technologies, such as third and fourth screens, learn about major programming genres, trace the key rules and regulations of television and cable, and inspect the costs related to production, distribution, and syndication of television programs, and finally investigate the impact of television and cable on democracy and our culture. Hopefully you will have already watched a short history lecture from YouTube that I posted along with our lectures this week. It does a much better job of explaining the technology than I can do and give some examples of footage of what this technology would have looked like. So hopefully, as you will have already learned there, even though people tend to think of television as not beginning until the mid-20th century after World War II, the technologies for it begin much earlier. So during the late 1800s, several technological developments set the stage for television that shared a lot of the common innovations with radio and telegraphy. So these things were all being developed at the same time. I think because it took longer for it to appear, we have a tendency to imagine that the visual was a much later technological development, when in fact they were really kind of coming together along with sound. Earliest modes of television technology were mechanical and did not use electricity and often required a crank or some other kind of mechanical implementation to function. The scanning disc, created by Paul Nipkow, sometimes referred to as the Nipkow disc, was a large flat metal disc with a series of small perforations arranged in a spiral pattern. So that would be this piece right here. This is a pattern of what that looks like. See, she has one here as well. As the disc rotated, light passed through the holes, separating pictures into pinpoints of light that could be transmitted. The number of scanned lines equaled each rotation of the disc and produced a television frame. Nipkow's mechanical disc served as the foundation for experiments on transmission of visual images for several decades. This schematic that I just pointed out here shows the circular paths traced by the holes, and that may also be square for greater precision. It didn't need to be round in that way. The area of the disc outlined in black shows the region that would be scanned. This is where the scanning would happen in that small section. Because it's a contained amount, the movement helps produce that image. That video I posted does a great job and shows you exactly what that would look like from her perspective. Ferdinand Braun, in 1897, played a vital role as the forerunner of the TV picture tube, otherwise known as the cathode ray tube. It was initially created as a scanning device known as a cathode ray oscilloscope. The CRT, or cathode ray tube, effectively combined the principles of the camera and electricity. It had a fluorescent screen that emitted visible light in the form of images when struck by a beam of electrons. But it's really in the beginning of the 20th century that things start to speed up. By the 1920s, we're starting to see a lot of really rapid developments across the globe. So both the Nipkow and the cathode ray were both created by Germans. At the same time, we also have British inventor John Logie Baird and the American Farnsworth simultaneously creating their own technologies with very similar overlap. So in 1926, John Logie Baird gave us the world's first public demonstration of a television system. And this was in a huge and very famous department store of the time called Selfridges in London, which still exists. He also used mechanical rotating discs to scan moving images into electrical impulses. Those were then transmitted by cable to a screen. One of the first things Baird does is create this process of transmission. In 1927, he extended his system by transmitting a signal internationally between London and New York. And at the same time, Farnsworth in the United States transmitted the first all-electronic TV picture by rotating a single straight line scratched into a square piece of painted glass by 90 degrees. Again, not a thing that I can really explain in a way that's compelling, but worth checking out in a video. By 1928, television broadcasting had been formalized by the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC, when it authorized inventor Charles Jenkins to broadcast from W3XK, an experimental radio station, in Maryland in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. He sent silhouette images from motion picture films, and those were broadcast to the general public on a regular basis at a resolution of about 48 lines in comparison to about 600, which becomes the standard for digital television years later. So you can imagine that's kind of a grim picture. By 1929, the British Broadcasting Corporation, as still known as the BBC, adopted Baird's mechanical system, and by 1932, Baird had developed the first commercially viable television system and was selling sets and has sold about 10,000 in that year. Experimental stations were running broadcasts throughout the 1930s in the United States, but especially in the US, even though we're seeing the sale of television sets in the UK, in the US in the 1930s, television was initially available only to the very privileged few. Sets ranged from $200 to $600, which in the 1930s was a huge sum of money. The average salary at that time was between $1,300 and $1,400, under $2,000 a year. And we're still coming in the US out of the Great Depression, and there's a general sense of ill ease at spending large sums of money. So some major things have to happen in the US before the technology begins to take off. In 1939, Sarnoff, who you'll remember as the bully of radio and the head of RCA and its subsidiary NBC becomes the first network to introduce regular television broadcasts. It transmits its inaugural telecast at the opening ceremonies of the New York World's Fair. If you haven't checked out the architectural remnants of the New York World's Fair, it is really worth a visit to the Queen's Museum in New York to see that. RCA was also suing Farnsworth over the patent of the iconoscope. The ruling is that Farnsworth was the inventor, and though Sarnoff liked to secure patents for the technologies he was using in his broadcast industries, he at this point then needs to license patents from Farnsworth to use that technology. Television really gets going after some hiccups in the 1940s in the United States. The analog model is adopted officially in 1941. Previous network stations, like Sarnoff's NBC and RCA, begin moving a lot of their operations to television, and by 1948, network TV grows from 8 cities to 23. And television sales themselves go up 500% from earlier in that decade. We're now, of course, at this point, post-World War II in 1948, and a post-war economy in the United States. There's a much higher income. There's a lot less anxiety in the air from the Great Depression. And people feel more optimistic and more willing to spend. And at the same time, as the technology has become more common, prices have also gone down. Because of the rapid growth of television at this time, the FTC issues a freeze in 1948 to stop granting new licenses to television stations and networks. This is not unlike what we saw with radio, where in the early days we have a completely unregulated sort of population of the airwaves. So this freeze lasts until 1952, when the 6th report and order was issued, establishing more flexible rules around where stations could be located, and firmly establishing a stronger preference be given to local community-driven stations, and that 20% of all stations be reserved for non-commercial use, like public broadcasting. So like radio, we see broadcast technologies as being seen as a tool of public service. And once the freeze has ended, television resumes its rapid expansion, growing from 345 cities and communities to 12,191 within a very short time frame. Another major development in early television was that of color, which is first established in the late 1950s, and by the 1960s, an estimated 90% of US households had a television. A lot of things were broadcast in color, but if you didn't have a color set, you could still receive them, but you would see them in black and white. So TV was a uniquely different format from film, which we'll be looking at more next week. Not yet turning a profit with their TV divisions, the broadcast networks that had begun in radio and now had taken over TV and were still making good money in radio. They couldn't afford to make little movies for nightly broadcasts in the early days of television. Early TV, like radio, was invested in its immediacy and inexpensive production, and often the use of live broadcasts as sort of its strongest appeal. Like radio, early television programs also had single sponsors that paid for the programs. Sponsors had the most control because they were producing the content financially. Because networks didn't have much control over the content that they got to air, networks started to request that programs be longer, which made them more costly for sponsors to make. And it made this single sponsorship model not very realistic. And networks wanted more control over the content they were producing. So they developed two new types of programs where they could have more of this control. One was the magazine format. In 1946, TV's first magazine-style show debuts. This is called the Television Screen Magazine. The show was a weekly half-hour program that ran until 1949 and covered a lot of topics. Certain sections were reoccurring and hosted by their editors. To reinforce the magazine format, magazine pages were turned before each new segment. Another early example of the magazine format is The Tonight Show, which we still see. The other model was the TV spectacular. These big television events often included live performances by different singers and actors, not unlike vaudeville and its adaptations to radio. We still have these kinds of events on major holidays and around award shows. The New Year's Eve events that we see in the United States are big common versions of this. Another favorite format was the primetime quiz show. Networks liked these because they were cheap to make and carry, and they were cheap for sponsors to produce. So even with awards given to people who won, it was still often cheaper than producing narrative fictional content. However, in order to reduce their costs, quiz show sponsors often rigged these quiz shows so as not to have to pay out too much money to winners. And eventually, this led to a scandal around a specific show called Quiz Show. There's a movie that was made about it that's really great. And this led eventually even to a congressional investigation in 1959. The ruling effectively ended sponsors' role in creating content because of that conflict of interest and moved the power to the networks and their control over content. If we think back to radio and how important the concept of live broadcast was to establishing public trust of the format as a space for the representation of truth, whether we're looking at FDR's fireside chats during the Depression or the way that World War II was discussed primarily through radio and a little bit through television, broadcast had worked really hard to establish itself as a space of truth-telling and reality. The impact of quiz shows changed not only the way that early television operated, but also introduced a great deal of public mistrust. People were upset and arguing that these programs were fixed. Networks dropped the quiz shows because of these scandals. And this also made people more critical of television. And many argued that it worked to undermine Americans' expectations of a kind of democratic promise of broadcast television. So while shows like Jeopardy have persisted in earlier time slots, primetime quiz shows didn't really have a comeback until 1999 with ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and that emerged as a top show at that time. But they still remain less a fixture of primetime broadcast television in the U.S. So as a result of some of these early controversies in television, networks would have to contend with increased government regulations in the 1960s and 70s. The Primetime Access Rule, passed in 1970, the PTAR, reduced network control of primetime programming to encourage more local programming and was a reaction to the monopoly of the impact of the big three, RCA, NBC, and ABC. The financial interest in syndication rule, also called FinCEN, was passed at the same time and banned networks for reaping profits from syndication. And finally, the Department of Justice also challenged networks by trying to limit the amount of non-news programs that a station could air. So again, we see this recurring commitment to the idea that broadcast should be a space for education and for communication to the public. Meanwhile, networks were also facing a growing challenge from the emergence of cable television. Cable sort of runs alongside network television in its development. Network television was the only model until the 1960s. Cable starts to appear at the end of the 1970s. Cable stations had more flexibility, could offer a wider range of programming than networks could. They eliminated over-air interference because of the structures. As you can see here, broadcast would be over-air. You can imagine that a number of things could cause issues for the reception of those waves in individual households, whereas cable had an over-air receiving antenna and translated all of these things into cables and to homes. The other thing that was appealing about the innovations of cable was that it provided a number of different kinds of services very different from what was available on broadcast television, where you sort of got what you got when you got it. These innovations in cable eventually set the stage for more modern streaming apps like we have today because of the ways that they package services. For example, for cable, you could buy a basic cable subscription, which included a large number of channels, or you could buy a premium cable subscription, which also allowed you to view channels like HBO, pay-per-view, and video on demand. So you would be able to order things specific to your taste. This is where we start to establish the on-demand relationship to media that in the end produces things like Netflix and Hulu that become the model for streaming services later. Although cable grew rapidly in popularity, it also would run up against a number of regulations because people were really worried that cable stations wouldn't provide access to public programming and community-driven programming that we saw as sort of foundationally important to broadcast. Network stations provided critical services like news, public health, and safety alerts, and not just entertainment, which was really typically what cable was producing. So must-carry rules were established that required cable operators to carry local broadcasts to make sure that there's still a distinction of locality and access to important local information. The FCC also mandated access to channels for the top 100 TV markets, along with leased channels. A landmark Supreme Court case, the FCC versus Midwest Video Corporation in 1979, determined that cable carriers needed to be thought of as electronic publishers legally. This was extremely important because as publishers, they became responsible for the content that aired on their stations. This meant that cable stations had to take their role as information intermediaries much more seriously because it opened them up to legal action for airing different kinds of content. Many people believe that television has had and still has an important role to play in democracy because of its role as an information intermediary, and also because it's a type of media that shares and manages information. In order to protect that function of television, the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 was passed, which led to the establishment of the Public Broadcasting Service, which you'll know as PBS. PBS was important because it targeted viewers that were not attractive to commercial networks, because they were not attractive to advertisers, and also because it recognized that public TV was and could be an important part of an informed citizenry and educated youth in the country, and something that needed to be legally protected. However, just like what we see with radio and NPR, PBS is now facing many challenges. There have been continued attempts from the government to reduce or remove funding, and as a result, PBS has become increasingly reliant on corporate underwriting to produce programming. So it's not as independent from profit motives as it used to be. For example, HBO now produces Sesame Street, one of PBS's premier educational programs for children. Audiences have also declined significantly for public broadcasting, especially with the accessibility of content in digital formats. Much of that programming is still popular and is being restreamed on YouTube, so people are still watching the content, but in different ways. Our short video this week, Why There Will Never Be Another Sesame Street, tells the story of the early days of PBS and the experimental media they were able to create, and its importance for establishing a foundation of racial and economic equality in the history of this time period in America. I hope you guys will take a look at that video. It's a really great one. Our book describes some of the main television formats that shape our current television landscape even now in the age of streaming. Many of these you'll recognize from the radio shows that preceded television. The first of these is comedy. It was one of the earliest and most popular formats for television, and a lot of it traveled directly over from radio. Many of the programs were just simply reproduced. These are made, so there's a number of different kinds, 3 main comedy formats used on television. Sketch comedy, which is made of short skits. This was a key element of early TV variety shows, which included singers, dancers, acrobats, animal acts, stand-up comics, and ventriloquists. The variety show, the sketch comedy, also resurrected the essentials of stage variety, entertainment, and vaudeville. Vaudeville was the precursor even to radio. Our most resilient version of this in the United States at this time is Saturday Night Live, which is a sketch comedy show that's been on since the 70s. A sitcom, or situation comedy, features a recurring cast, and each episode establishes a narrative situation, complicates it, develops increasing confusion among its characters, and then resolves the complication by the end of half an hour, usually. Some examples of this would be I Love Lucy, Seinfeld, The Big Bang Theory, Friends. In many sitcoms, Character development is downplayed in favor of zany plots. Characters are usually static and predictable, and they generally do not develop much during the course of a series. However, in some sitcoms, once referred to as domestic comedies, characters and settings are typically more important than complicated predicaments. Greater emphasis is placed on character development than on establishing the order that has been disrupted by confusion. Such comedies often take place primarily in a home, such as in Modern Family, or in a workplace, such as in Parks and Recreation. Another important TV format that we have many examples of today is drama. The first of these was the anthology drama, a popular type of drama in early television that brought together the modes of live dramatic theater to a television audience. This became less popular over time for various economic and political reasons. The first was that advertisers disliked anthologies as they often presented complex stories that contained issues that were not easily resolved. This was in high contrast to the commercials that interrupted the drama, which often told upbeat stories in which problems were easily solved by purchasing a product. So things which challenge the models of modernity, as would be the case in one of the most common of these, the Twilight Zone, didn't appeal to advertisers. Second, there was a change in audience. People who could afford TV sets in the early 1950s were also those who would be able to afford theater tickets, and were similarly people who would often go to the theater. And so anthology drama was a welcome addition to their cultural tastes. But by the mid-1950s, working and middle-class families were increasingly able to afford television sets, and anthology dramas were not as popular to this newly expanding market. They preferred things like variety sketch shows and situational comedies. They were extremely expensive to produce because they were a lot like tiny movies. They were narrative, they were fictional, they required sets, and often required recognized actors. Finally, anthologies that dealt seriously with changing social landscape often attracted controversy. This was especially true during the attempts by Senator Joseph McCarthy and his followers to rid media industries and government agencies of left-leaning influences. The format still continues, however, mostly on public television, with the imported British programs of Masterpiece Theatre, Masterpiece Classic, Masterpiece Mystery. Honestly, and then we're also seeing a revitalization of them in shows like American Horror Story, which works similarly to produce season-long mini-series, but with a kind of anthology model. Abandoning anthologies generally, though, producers and writers increasingly developed episodic series, dramatic series, first used on radio in 1929. Today, we see many episodic drama series which appear in the chapter show format, where there's no real narrative connection between most shows, or they might have a personal drama between regular characters, but each episode still functions on its own with a discrete conclusion. The entire franchise of Law and Order, CSI, a lot of the crime dramas where people are solving a problem in the course of one episode. On the other end, we have serial dramas, which have long narrative arcs between episodes and seasons and require that you watch them in progression and are much more about character development. This would be like The Sopranos, Game of Thrones, even soap operas fit into this model. Another foundational format to television is the news, and news has been around since the 1940s on television, with many programs like Meet the Press and CBS News that still remain on television from that era, but of course with different hosts. Cable transformed the news by introducing all news channels like CNN, C-SPAN, etc., creating the possibility for a 24-hour news cycle because they could screen programming around the clock. Because networks air both news and entertainment programs, they've been at a disadvantage, as the news cycle has not only become 24/7, but also faster because of digital technologies, and many network news programs, for instance, Fox, have produced 24-hour news cycles of their own through digital content production. Some other important traditional genres that have persisted today include talk shows, game shows, sporting events, and reality TV. Reality TV has grown increasingly popular in recent decades because they are inexpensive to produce, and audiences often find characters on these shows to be more relatable or relevant than more genre-driven scripted content. There's also been an increased demand for multilingual programming in the United States, so more Spanish-language TV stations have become available on U.S. networks and cable subscriptions like Univision and Telemundo. A lot of this also becomes even more evident as we develop more streaming stations. So there are a few key concepts that our authors cover in the book related to television that I want to touch on briefly. The concept of production refers to everything that goes into creating television programming. Production costs are often discussed in two ways: below the line and above the line. Below the line costs refer to the technical or hardware side of production. So that means equipment, cameras, light sets, transportation, lighting, things like that. Above the line costs, or otherwise referred to as software, are the creative costs. This is writers, directors, producers, editors, art department, etc. Usually the above the line costs take up the vast majority of the budget of production, especially on long running shows where actors are starting to get paid more and more the longer they're on the show. Production is funded through something called deficit financing. Film studios and investors pay for production in the hopes that they'll make money back later, specifically if the shows go into syndication, which we'll talk about in a second. Programs like news and reality TV shows typically have lower production costs, especially at that above the line level, because they're not producing new sets every week. They're not bringing in new actors consistently. The low production costs make those more appealing to networks, and the profits from these shows can offset costs of other shows on the network. At the other end, from production, is distribution. Programs are paid for in a number of ways, either subscription fees to broadcasting networks to carry network channels and programming, licensing fees from affiliate stations, and by advertising costs. While broadcast networks earn carriage fees from cable and DBS providers, they also pay affiliate station license fees to carry their programs. In return, the networks sell the bulk of advertising to recoup fees and their investments in these programs. In this arrangement, local stations receive national programs that attract large local audiences, and they're allotted some local ad time to sell during the programs to generate their own revenue. And then we have the model of the O&O, which is owned and operated, although traditional networks like NBC own stations in major markets like New York, LA, and Chicago. Throughout most of the country, networks do not own affiliates, but sign short-term contracts to rent time on local stations. In the affiliate model, local affiliates typically carry a network's entire lineup, but they can also substitute another program according to clearance rules, which were established in the 1940s. And the affiliates are ultimately responsible for the content of their channels, so they must clear and approve all network programming amongst themselves. This has led to some affiliates pushing the programming of network television. A particularly upsetting and racist example of this is in the 1950s, Nat King Cole, who was the first Black performer to host a variety program on network television. A number of affiliate stations refused to carry the program, and so NBC was pushed to cancel it in 1957. So affiliates can wield a large amount of power, for better or worse. Another important concept our book talks about is syndication, which is the leasing of the exclusive right to air a television show. Syndication is how production companies make money because the station is paying them for the rights to air their programming. There are two forms of syndication that are common. Off-network syndication is reruns or older programs that no longer run during network time, made available to local stations, cable operators, online services, etc. And then there's first-run syndication, where any program that's specifically produced for sale into syndication markets. So that means it's produced without a specific network in mind. This happens when shows do not have a contract with a network. The production company thinks the show is strong enough to get picked up on its own. Sometimes this happens with shows that are based on movies or on popular characters, and there's sort of an expected guaranteed market. Traditionally, syndication has been where production companies make the most money. A well-known example of the amount of money that can be made through syndication is Seinfeld, which has made over $3 billion in syndication since it aired. Another is Friends, and currently Friends still earns $1 billion per year in syndication, and each cast member earns $20 million per year. Syndication is where the big money is. This is most of what shows are hoping for. So when television is produced, they're ideally looking for things that will be popular for many, many years. So other concepts discussed a lot in relation to television are ratings and shares, which represent two different ways of measuring viewing. Ratings are one form of measurement, which assesses the percentage of households that are tuned into a sampled program. Shares, on the other hand, measures the viewership based on the number of people actually using their TV sets at the time. So how many eyeballs are looking at this particular show. These measures of viewing are important for a variety of reasons. Most important to advertisers is that advertisers know how many people have been exposed to their ads, which helps determine the value of the ad space. They also help TV stations know which programs resonate the most with viewers, and they give production companies leverage for continuing to get renewed by TV stations, especially if those in charge might not like the TV show, but if a huge viewership exists, that can have some weight. So in today's digital media landscape, these long used measures don't make as much sense because people consume media differently than they used to. Convergence is changing how TV viewing is measured. Even on digital-only platforms like YouTube, we see these same types of metrics being used as on traditional television. YouTube creators have incentives for the amount of views that their video get. Based on their views, they might be able to get more money from advertisers. So we're still seeing advertising profit motives being connected to the way that we measure viewership, but in a slightly different way. In the 21st century, television viewership dropped dramatically, especially in younger demographics, and less than half of households in the US had a cable subscription by 2018. So not only were networks in decline, but so too is cable. One reason for the decline, some scholars say, is because there were just too many networks and too many viewing choices for viewers who in the digital age now want a more curated or personalized experience that they can get from streaming services. Because of how much lower viewership there is among younger populations, many argue that television no longer has as much influence on society. However, others argue that television programming still has a significant impact. It's just harder to measure because of the multimedia ways in which people consume that content. As a result of the decline in advertising dollars, many argue that television now works on a cheaper is better mentality. This is why we see, for example, a shift towards more and more reality television shows because of their lower production costs. People often refer to the convergence of TV with the internet as the third screen. The computer becomes the third space where content is viewed versus theaters and televisions. Early on, it was thought that people would mainly watch TV and use streaming on the internet as a way to catch up on things they would normally watch on TV. But popular sites like YouTube, Hulu, and Netflix changed this by offering streaming through the internet and increasingly often offering content made for their platforms. The book also introduces the concept of the fourth screen technology, or the use of mobile devices to watch television. The fact that television is now mobile and can be watched in many different places at different times has allowed different consumer viewing habits, which has then meant many major changes in media content creation for production companies. For example, the rise of short-form content, which is easier to watch while on the go. In the age of convergence, Netflix, once little more than a DVD rental service, has taken over the market and now not only streams content it licenses, but has become a top producing content creator, beginning in 2012 with House of Cards and current budgets for over $10 billion yearly on original TV shows. So in the age of convergence, we'll see a lot of ways that companies are growing in conglomerate models, more consolidation, more conglomeration. A lot of this was facilitated by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which we also talked about last week in relationship to radio. This abolished ownership restrictions. So today owners can buy as many stations as they want, as long as it doesn't reach more than 39% of the nation's 120 million plus TV households. It also spurred the new investment of telecommunications, AT&T, et cetera, into the cable properties for AOL and Time Warner. So in other words, what you're seeing is what had been cable companies that were primarily invested in delivering television are now also taking ownership of broadband resources and other things like that. This allowed for that expansion, but it also meant that we're still seeing the same very small number of companies take over more and more of the market. This has raised concerns that the merging of telecommunication companies will limit expression and lead to price fixing. And television has undergone a number of changes in relationship to ownership and content. Major networks and cable companies have continued to consolidate under fewer and fewer owners, which has led to a decrease in competition for TV networks. Our book does a great job here of explaining different kinds of companies, and I encourage you guys to check this out a little bit more closely. So one really exciting way that people have attempted to negotiate this price fixing and the inaccessibility of broadband around the United States, hundreds of communities, cooperatives, and indigenous territories have made investments in telecommunication networks and begun building these small publicly owned cable systems, which are not for profit and often offer less expensive services, including cable and broadband, that are structurally designed to meet community needs rather than profit motives. So that's a very exciting model. There's a link to that, by the way, if you want to check it out in our module this week. That map's pretty great. In regards to content changes, we see a lot of things really shifting in television with decreased interests from viewers. This has made a lot of people anxious about the possibility of television to have an influence on society. In the 1950s and 60s, television images of the civil rights movement visually documented inequalities faced by Black citizens in the US. Seeing these images made the events and struggles more real to a nation of viewers and helped garner support for the movement. Similarly, the Vietnam War, which was the first to be experienced through television reporting, is widely referred to as the television war. And the visibility of war and its horrors is also recognized as a major cause for the anti-war movement. Convergence has the potential to de-emphasize the idea that we are all citizens who are part of a larger nation and world. Some have argued that the consolidation of TV networks and production companies are also threats to TV's potential to be a vehicle for democracy. On the other hand, we're seeing more perspectives, more voices through things like YouTube, through things like smaller productions. The ability for people to directly produce and share content has become much more possible, much more accessible. And yet we're also seeing this moment where we're feeling less like we're seeing things all at the same time in some way. So TV, or at least televisual technologies, are becoming more participatory through social media and other formats. So viewers can be engaged on important topics and issues. TV still remains, in many ways, a gathering place for friends and family and social networks. And in the future, this will be about serving smaller rather than larger audiences, with some questions about the ramifications of that shift on its democratic potential. All of these considerations are important to pay attention to, and it's important to recognize both the limits and the potential of television, like any other media, as contributing to our current democratic landscape and also its tensions with profit motives. Thanks for getting through another 2-chapter lecture week. I know it's kind of a lot. Be sure you read your chapter 7 and 6 to make sure you're understanding the overarching concepts. We'll do a discussion after this chapter where we talk about what we learned in history, what are some of the repeating patterns that we see in media industry. So keep an eye out for those things as you're reading. Do your Achieve assignments. Those seem to be going pretty well for folks. For the first half of the semester, you get the grade of just doing it. So it's 1 point, you get 1 point for doing it. But for the second half, you get the grade that shows up in Achieve. So keep that in mind as you're moving forward. You want to make sure that you're paying attention as you're answering your questions. For your participation discussion this week, listen to the podcast or watch short videos for participation discussion. I really recommend the ones on public television. I think they're important discussions, especially for our time period where we're looking at more corporate control of media and the loss of any form of public media. I'm hoping some of you want to talk about that. Be sure to check out your classmates' mass media lectures. People have been doing great work. Be supportive of your classmates. They're awesome. Writing analysis options for this week, you have 2. You can either do an analysis of the film Birth of a Movement, which is about a civil rights response to the film Birth of a Nation and its re-releases in different points in history, or you can do a MIDI on movie watching in cinemas or as home entertainment. Just a note on your writing assignments, you can choose one that is a content analysis, like looking at newspaper pages or a documentary film, but one of them needs to be a study. So you get to pick 2 across the whole semester. One needs to be a study, one can be content analysis. You can do 2 studies, but you can't do 2 content analysis because I want to make sure you guys get a little bit of a crash course in how media scholars do their research. So make sure you do at least one of them. If you've already done one and it's been a documentary, don't pick a second documentary. If you have any more questions about any of that, let me know. I should be emailing you guys soon with updates on where you are in your progress in the class. Usually I do that about halfway through the semester. As always, if you are confused or something was late or you're having some issues, send me emails, plan to meet with me, don't hide about it. If you sent me an email and you asked for something and I said we need to meet, it's because it's something I don't necessarily know how to answer in an email, or it's something I feel like I've answered in other places in writing. So I don't know what the best thing to do is for you at that moment. So please reach out to me and set up a time for us to talk so I can figure out how to help. Take care, guys. Have a good one.